Margaret Clare walked barefoot through the marble corridors of Henderson Industries, her worn shoes clutched tightly in her left hand along with a simple paper shopping bag. The elegant white blazer and charcoal skirt she wore had been carefully pressed that morning, but her feet told a different story. The 33 other candidates lined the hallway in their pristine business attire, their polished shoes gleaming under the soft lighting. As Margaret passed, hushed whispers followed her like autumn leaves in the wind. "Look at her feet," someone murmured behind a manicured hand. Did she really come barefoot to Henderson Industries? The shoes in her hand looked absolutely ancient. Margaret kept walking, her chin held high despite the burning in her cheeks. She had learned long ago that dignity wasn't measured by what covered your feet, but by how firmly you planted them on the ground when life tested you. 24 years earlier, Margaret had been the promising marketing director at a thriving firm. Then came the diagnosis, her mother's early-onset dementia at just 58. Without hesitation, Margaret had resigned to become a full-time caregiver. For nearly 2 decades, she had watched the woman who taught her to read slowly forget how to speak her own daughter's name. 6 months ago, her mother had passed peacefully in her sleep, leaving Margaret with a small inheritance and a gap in her resume that seemed impossible to explain. At 54, she was starting over in a world that had changed dramatically during her absence. This morning, her last pair of professional shoes had finally given up. The sole had separated completely as she climbed the subway stairs. Rather than miss this opportunity at Henderson Industries, she had made a choice that would have seemed unthinkable to her younger self. As she approached the interview room, Margaret noticed a distinguished gentleman in his late 60s observing the scene from the end of the hallway. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his kind eyes seemed to take in everything without judgment. He wore an expensive but understated suit, and there was something about his presence that commanded quiet respect. "Excuse me," called out Jennifer Kim, a polished woman in her 30s with perfect everything, from her designer heels to her confident smirk. "Don't you think there's a certain standard of professionalism expected here?" Margaret turned slowly. "I believe professionalism is about competence, integrity, and respect for others. My qualifications remain the same whether I'm wearing shoes or not." The distinguished gentleman stepped forward, and Margaret noticed how the candidates suddenly straightened. "I'm Richard Henderson," he said simply, "and I'm curious to hear your story." The hallway fell silent. Margaret had studied the company extensively, but she hadn't expected to meet the CEO himself before her formal interview. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm Margaret Clare. I apologize for my unconventional appearance. My shoes gave out on the way here, and I had a choice: arrive on time without proper footwear or arrive late with an excuse. I chose to honor your time." "That's an interesting choice," Henderson replied, his weathered face thoughtful. "Walk with me." They strolled down the corridor together, past the line of impeccably dressed candidates who watched in bewilderment. Henderson gestured toward a quiet alcove with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Tell me about the gap in your resume," he said gently. Margaret had rehearsed various explanations, but something in Henderson's manner invited honesty instead of strategy. "I spent 20 years caring for my mother who had dementia. I left my career to make sure she had the best possible quality of life in her final years." Henderson nodded slowly. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was the most challenging and rewarding thing I've ever done," Margaret replied. "I learned patience I never knew I possessed. I discovered that real communication isn't just about words, and I found strength in making difficult decisions when there was no good option, only the right one." "Like coming here today without shoes?" Margaret smiled for the first time since entering the building. "Exactly like that." Henderson studied her for a long moment. "Margaret, I built this company from nothing 40 years ago. I've interviewed thousands of people, and I've learned that character reveals itself in unexpected moments. Today, 33 candidates showed me their resumes and their polish, but only one showed me who she really is when facing an impossible choice." He paused, looking out at the bustling city below. "My own mother spent her final years in a care facility. I was too busy building this empire to spend time with her before she passed. I've regretted that decision every day since." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but she kept them at bay. You couldn't have known. No, but I could have chosen differently, Henderson replied. The same way you chose differently today. Leadership isn't about having perfect shoes, Margaret. It's about having the courage to walk forward when the path is uncomfortable. He turned to face her fully. I'd like to offer you the position of Senior Director of Customer Relations. It's a role that requires someone who understands that our clients are people first, customers second. Someone who knows that real value comes from authentic connection, not polished presentation. Margaret's breath caught. Mr. Henderson, I'm incredibly grateful, but shouldn't we complete the formal interview process? Henderson chuckled, a warm sound that filled the quiet alcove. My dear, the interview began the moment you chose to walk through those doors barefoot. Everything else is just paperwork. As they walked back toward the elevator, Margaret noticed the other candidates were being dismissed by Henderson's assistant. Their confused expressions followed her as she passed. Still barefoot, still carrying her broken shoes, but now carrying something else. The knowledge that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is simply be authentically human. There's one more thing, Henderson said as they reached the elevator. I want you to know that your mother would be incredibly proud of the woman you've become. The sacrifice you made for her speaks to a depth of character that no business school could ever teach. Margaret's composure finally cracked, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. That means more to me than you could possibly know. Please call me Richard, he said warmly. And Margaret, I have a feeling you're going to transform how we connect with people. Our clients deserve someone who understands that behind every business transaction is a human being with their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams. The elevator doors opened, and as Margaret stepped inside, she turned back to see Jennifer Kim watching from down the hallway. For just a moment, their eyes met, and Margaret offered a gentle smile. Jennifer looked away quickly, but not before Margaret caught something unexpected in her expression. Not mockery, but something that looked almost like respect. 6 months later, Margaret Clare stood in the same marble hallway, this time welcoming new interview candidates. She wore sensible, comfortable shoes that would last for years, but her approach remained unchanged. She looked beyond the polished exteriors to see the person underneath. On her office wall hung a framed photograph of her and her mother from better days, alongside her first Employee Recognition Award. But folded carefully in her desk drawer was the old pair of shoes that had brought her here. A reminder that sometimes our greatest perceived weaknesses become our most unexpected strengths. Margaret had revolutionized the customer relations department, implementing programs that treated each client interaction as an opportunity for genuine human connection. Under her leadership, customer satisfaction scores had reached record highs, and employee retention in her department was the best in company history. When young professionals asked her for career advice, Margaret would always tell them the same thing. Competence gets you in the door, but character determines how far you'll go. Never be ashamed of the journey that shaped you, because that journey is what makes you irreplaceable. And remember, sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is simply show up as yourself, broken shoes and all. Richard Henderson, now approaching his 70th birthday, often reflected on that day in the hallway. He had learned something valuable too, that wisdom often comes disguised as vulnerability, and that the best leaders are those who understand that strength isn't about perfection, but about perseverance with grace.